The rise and fall of Richard Nixon. What events influenced Richard Nixon's rise to and fall from power? Introduction. On September 23, 1952, California Senator Richard Nixon reserved a spot on the television to deliver the most important speech of his career. With this address, Nixon hoped to squash rumors that he had accepted $18,000 in illegal political contributions to finance personal expenses. The Republicans had recently nominated Nixon to run for vice president on Dwight D. Eisenhower's ticket. When these charges against Nixon became public, Eisenhower was non-committal. He did not drop Nixon from the ticket, but he also did not defend him. In his speech, Nixon said, "Not 1 cent of the $18,000 or any other money of that type ever went to me for my personal use. Every penny of it was used to pay for political expenses that I did not think should be charged to the taxpayers of the United States." But he did confess to accepting one personal gift. A man down in Texas heard my wife, Pat, on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from Union Station in Baltimore saying we had a package for us. When we went down to get it, you know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate. He'd sent all the way from Texas, black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, a 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids are all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. Senator Richard Nixon, Checkers speech, September 23, 1952. Nixon's Checkers speech proved a high point in his tumultuous government career that culminated in his presidential election in 1968. As the president, Nixon would engineer stunning successes in both domestic and foreign affairs, as well as orchestrate his own humiliating fall from power. Richard Nixon's rise to the presidency. Born in California in 1913, Richard Nixon was one of 5 brothers. He financed both his college and law school educations. After serving in the Navy during World War II, Nixon was elected to the House of Representatives and later to the Senate. From 1953 to 1960, he served as vice president for Dwight D. Eisenhower. Nixon lost to John F. Kennedy in a very close presidential election of 1960. 2 years later, Nixon lost the race for governor of California and announced his retirement from politics in his concession speech. "You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore," he told reporters. In reality, Nixon's political career was far from over. A bumpy road to the White House. Nixon commenced his spectacular political comeback by winning the Republican presidential nomination in 1968. Nixon's nomination was only one surprising occurrence in this tumultuous election year. First, President Lyndon B. Johnson unexpectedly decided not to run for re-election. Soon thereafter, followed by the shocking assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. In another surprise, Alabama Governor George Wallace mounted a strong campaign for president in the American Independent Party ticket. During his state's civil rights struggle, Wallace had been an ardent segregationist, garnering support from white voters in the South. Wallace also appealed to the average man on the street by attacking the liberal intellectuals and long hairs who have run the country for too long. The year's final shock was caused by the outbreak of violence in Chicago, Illinois during the Democratic National Convention. Anti-war protesters clashed with police outside the convention as Vice President Hubert Humphrey secured the Democratic nomination on a pro-war platform. The Democratic Party left the convention anything but united. These troubling events augmented many Americans' fear that the country was unstable, so Nixon prioritized addressing these concerns in his campaign. He stated, "We live in a deeply troubled and profoundly unsettled time. Drugs, crime, campus revolts, racial discord, draft resistance, and on every hand we find one himself the hero of ordinary people. People who worked hard, paid their taxes, loved their country." Nixon appealed to their desire for stability by promising a renewed government commitment to law and order. Nixon used a, quote, Southern strategy, end quote, to win over the Democratic South. He chose a Southern governor, Spiro Agnew of Maryland, as his running mate. Nixon related to conservative Southern voters by emphasizing states' rights and limited the federal government's values that Southern Democrats often supported. The election was very close. Nixon won with only 43.4% of the popular vote. Wallace won a plurality, or more votes than any other candidate, but not a majority in 5 southern states. Democrats retained control of Congress. Because Nixon lacked both a strong electoral mandate and a Republican majority in Congress, it was unclear whether he could effectively lead the country. Nixon's domestic policies, a conservative and liberal blend. Because he won the presidency by a narrow margin, Nixon tried to appeal to both conservatives and liberals once in office. He appeased conservatives with a plan called New Federalism to reduce the size and power of the federal government. After a third of a century of power flowing from the people to the states, to Washington, Nixon explained, it is time for new federalism, in which power, funds, and responsibilities will flow from Washington to the people. The centerpiece of Nixon's new federalism was a proposal called revenue sharing, in which the federal government distributed tax revenues to states and local governments to spend as they saw fit. State and local leaders approved of the increased funds and expanded spending powers mandated by revenue sharing. The practice also proved popular with conservatives. State and local leaders approved. Nixon proved less successful at shrinking the federal government, although he did eliminate some of LBJ's Great Society bureaucracy, including the Office of Economic Opportunity. Nixon expanded several social benefits programs. Additionally, he increased Social Security and enlarged the food stamp program. Nixon further increased the size and power of the federal government by approving new federal agencies, including the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. Occupational Health and Safety Administration, OSHA, which was charged with protecting workers on the job. He also established the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, in order to protect human health and to safeguard the natural environment. Nixon's most unexpected proposal was the Family Assistance Plan, which called for the government to support every poor American family with a minimum annual income. To be eligible to receive this support, family members capable of working would be required to seek employment. The Family Assistance Plan would have greatly expanded the number of families eligible for public assistance. Nixon believed that this program would appeal to liberals, but he also hoped it would interest conservatives since the plan increased states' responsibilities for running welfare programs. Instead, conservatives attacked the plan as a reward for laziness, while liberals denounced the proposed guaranteed income as insufficient. After much debate, Congress rejected the plan. A mixed record on civil rights. Nixon's civil rights policies were mixed as the rest of his domestic agenda. To carry out his Southern strategy, Nixon sought to appoint conservative Southern judges to the Supreme Court. His first 2 appointees had previously supported segregation, and the Senate rejected them both. When the Voting Rights Act was submitted for renewal in 1970, Nixon introduced changes to the legislation. Congress rejected his proposals, which would have reduced federal oversight of voting officials in the South. Nonetheless, Nixon resigned the Voting Rights Act. Nixon re-signed the Voting Rights Act into law. At the same time, Nixon sought to increase economic opportunities for African Americans by expanding affirmative action. Under the Philadelphia Plan, he required construction companies working on federally funded programs to hire a specified number of minority workers. Nixon also encouraged black capitalism by providing federal assistance to black-owned businesses. At the same time, Nixon sought to increase economic opportunities for African Americans by expanding affirmative action. Under the Philadelphia Plan, he required construction companies working on federally funded programs to hire a specified number of minority workers. Nixon also encouraged black capitalism by providing federal assistance to black-owned businesses. When Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he commented that, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republicans for a long time to come." His prediction began to materialize during the presidential election of 1968, when Democratic Hubert Humphrey won only the southern state. One southern state. Segregationist George Wallace won 5, and Republican Richard Nixon carried the remaining southern states. The Nixon administration founded the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 1971. This organization was created to ensure safe workplaces in America. In his 1968 presidential election campaign, Nixon related to moderate middle-of-the-road voters in a pamphlet titled "The Nixon Standard." He outlined his position on 5 key issues facing the country. These critical issues were winning the peace fighting rising crime, progressing with order, preventing runaway government, and maintaining respect for America. Demonstration increase on city streets and college campuses. The national economy struggled throughout the Nixon presidency. In 1970, the United States entered a recession. During a normal recession, unemployment rises, wages drop, and consumers spend less money. To encourage people to buy goods, companies lower their prices, driving business activity and eventually ending the recession. However, in the early 1970s, the nation experienced an economic condition known as stagflation, or an economic condition in which prices and the rate of unemployment increase simultaneously. So Americans faced both a stagnant economy and rapid inflation. Nixon responded to stagflation by first addressing the issue of inflation with a three-phase program. In Phase 1, he froze wages and prices for 90 days. In Phase 2, he created a new federal agency to strictly limit future wage and price increases. Before implementing Phase 3, Nixon turned to unemployment increasing government spending to filter more money into the economy. After unemployment rates fell, Nixon enacted Phase 3 of his inflation plan, replacing the strict wages and price controls with voluntary guidelines. But after these controls were lifted, the cost of living skyrocketed, rising at the fastest rate since the end of World War II. To make matters worse, oil exporting nations in the Middle East stopped shipping oil to the United States in the fall of 1973. This oil embargo was established to protect U.S. Support for Israel in conflicts between Israel and Arab nations. It resulted in a nationwide energy crisis in the United States. To conserve dwindling supplies, the government urged homeowners to lower their thermostats and reduce highway speed limits to 55 miles per hour. The crisis did not end until Middle Eastern nations lifted the embargo the following year. President Nixon's foreign policy record. Richard Nixon's early political career was characterized by his staunch opposition to communism, but as president, Nixon was determined to reshape America's containment policy. He hoped to transition the country from a period of continual conflict to one of stable coexistence between the two superpowers. Nixon's realistic approach to foreign policy. Nixon centered his foreign policy on realpolitik, a German term meaning the politics of reality, which refers to politics based on practical rather than idealistic concerns. Nixon's top foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, supported the president's realistic approach. As part of their realpolitik strategy, Nixon and Kissinger concluded that the United States could no longer bear full responsibility for defending the free world. Addressing the nation in 1969, the president outlined his plan, which became known as the Nixon Doctrine. In his address, Nixon promised that the United States would continue to protect its allies from the Soviet or Chinese nuclear attacks. In other cases of aggression, however, the United States would expect the nation at risk to do more to help itself. The Vietnamization of Southeast Asia was one early application of the Nixon Doctrine. Nixon also applied the Nixon Doctrine to the Persian Gulf region of the Middle East. Persian Gulf nations had become increasingly important to the United States since these countries contained vast deposits of oil. However, the United States had no military forces stationed in the region. Rather than move troops in, Nixon sent military aid to Iran and Saudi Arabia, hoping that these allies would assume responsibility of maintaining peace and stability in the region. Meanwhile, the United States continued to supply its closest ally in the Middle East, Israel, with military and financial aid. The Nixon Doctrine's limitations were exposed when Israel was attacked by a coalition of Arab countries led by Egypt and Syria during the Yom Kippur holy days in October 1973. The Yom Kippur War only lasted 3 weeks, but it was long enough to trigger the oil embargo against the United States. Despite U.S. aid, Saudi Arabia backed the embargo to punish the United States for its long-standing support of Israel. In foreign relations with the Soviet Union and China, Nixon and Kissinger pursued a policy of détente, French for relaxation of tension or hostility. To many conservatives, détente seemed inconsistent with Nixon's earlier anti-communism. Some believed it violated U.S. interests and ideals. In contrast, most liberals approved any policy that might prevent a nuclear holocaust. Opening diplomatic relations with China. The policy of détente dramatically changed the U.S. interactions with China. When Nixon took office in 1969, the United States did not engage in diplomatic relations with China, nor did it officially recognize the communist government that had ruled mainland China since 1949. Nixon believed isolating China was no longer worthwhile and told Congress in 1970 that it was in the United States' national interest to improve practical relations with Peking, Beijing. The president had several motivations for establishing better relations with China. One was China's sheer size. One-fifth of the world's population lived in China. Additionally, the relationship between China and the Soviet Union had shifted from communist comrades to hostile neighbors. Nixon believed that establishing friendly diplomatic relations with China might pressure Soviet leaders who feared Chinese power to cooperate with the United States. A sporting event in April 1971 facilitated détente. That year, the Chinese government invited the U.S. table tennis team to play in Beijing. These 15 team members were the first Americans to visit Beijing since the communists came to power in China. Chinese leaders regarded the American athletes as ambassadors. Meeting with the U.S. team, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai stated that athletes' arrival in China marked a new chapter in U.S.-China relations. The Middle East contains more than half the world's proven crude oil reserves. Proven reserves are known deposits of petroleum that can be pumped at a reasonable cost. In the fall of 1973, Middle Eastern countries placed an oil embargo on the United States to protect its support of Israel. Shortly after the table tennis competition, Nixon announced proposals to initiate trade and travel between the two countries. 2 months later, Kissinger secretly traveled to China, and in July of 1971, Nixon announced that he would visit China the next year. The following February, Nixon and his wife, Pat, made an official state visit to China, during which Nixon pledged to establish formal diplomatic relations between the two countries. He described the trip as bridging 12,000 miles in 22 years of non-communication and hostility. Nixon's historic visit marked a turning point in relations between the United States and the world's largest communist nation. After the trip, China's communist government, based in Beijing, assumed China's seat in the United States. Until this time, the nationalist government of Taiwan had occupied China's seat. In 1973, the United States and China opened information offices in each other's capitals, and by 1979, the two countries were engaging in full diplomatic relations, working towards détente with the Soviet Union. Nixon's belief that the USSR would consider détente if the United States improved relations with China proved accurate. In May of 1972, just 3 months after visiting China, Nixon embarked on another historic journey, becoming the first American president to visit Moscow, the capital of the USSR. Soviet leaders Leonid Brezhnev invited Nixon partly in response to the Soviet concerns about U.S. involvement with China. Brezhnev's invitation also underscored the USSR's desire for U.S. economic and technological aid. Brezhnev and Nixon were able to negotiate a trade deal that benefited both countries. The United States agreed to sell at least $750 million worth of grain to the USSR over a 3-year period. The Soviet Union was not growing enough grain to feed its population. The deal also benefited American farmers who were happy to sell their surplus grain. The two leaders then negotiated a much more difficult agreement that limited the number of nuclear missiles that each country's arsenal. This agreement was enabled by spy satellites that had been developed in the 1960s as cameras mounted on these satellites photographed enemy missile sites, allowing the two countries to monitor one another. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, later called SALT I, was a 5-year agreement that limited the USSR to 1,618 missiles and the United States to 1,054. The United States accepted the smaller quantity because its missiles were more advanced than the USSR's. SALT I applied to both ground-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs. Nixon and Brezhnev also signed a statement of basic principles, which called on both of the superpowers to do their utmost to avoid military confrontations. Nixon was pleased with the initial agreement to halt the arms race. The historians of some future age, he predicted, will write that this was the year when America helped to lead the world up out of the lowlands of constant war and the high plateau of lasting peace. But the hopes that détente would create an era of cooperation between the superpowers dissolved over time. The USSR continued to support military struggles in the Third World and began supplementing its missiles with multiple warheads in order to bypass treaty limits. As a result, conservative détente critics concluded that the Soviet Union should never be trusted again. During the 1960s, U.S. and Soviet engineers equipped Satellites with long-range cameras to build spies in the sky. These spy satellites ejected canisters of undeveloped film back towards Earth. When a canister reached the upper atmosphere, an attached parachute opened, and a passing airplane would catch the canister mid-air. President Nixon's historic trip to China in 1972 marked the first visit by a U.S. president to the communist country. Nixon attempted to establish friendly relations with Chinese leaders during his visit. Here, Nixon converses with Madame Mao, a prominent figure in China's Communist Party, at an opera. At the height of the Watergate scandal, Nixon released recordings of White House conversations about the break-in. On one tape, 18.5 minutes of silence were recorded over a particular conversation between Nixon and an aide. This cover-up fueled America's distrust in the political leader. Here's the demonstrated call for Nixon's impeachment. Watergate ends Nixon's career. On June 17, 1972, five men broke into the offices of the Democratic National Committee, located in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. A security guard caught the oddly dressed burglars, who were fitted with suits and bugging or wiretapping devices. An investigation concluded that they had ties to the re-election campaign. Early news reports of the break-in did not prevent Nixon from winning the 1972 presidential election in a landslide, but the bungled burglary and cover-up attempts would eventually lead to his downfall. Abusing power to limit dissent. Although the Watergate burglars' intentions were unclear at first, their actions were part of a larger pattern of abusing presidential power. Nixon often viewed critics of his policies as threats to national security. Once elected, he developed an enemies list that included reporters, politicians, activists, and celebrities whom he considered unfriendly to his administration. He authorized the FBI to tap the phones of news reporters whom he felt were biased against him, as well as members of his own staff whom he felt were biased against him, as well as members of his own staff who he distrusted. Because a judge had not authorized these wiretaps, they were unconstitutional. Thus, they represented an abuse of power. Nixon was also gravely concerned about secrecy. He established his own White House security operation to investigate leaks of damaging information to the press. This group was nicknamed the Plumbers because their primary task was to plug leaks. In 1971, the Plumbers broke into the office of a psychiatrist whose clients included Daniel Ellsberg, a former defense analyst. Nixon suspected Ellsberg of leaking the Pentagon Papers, a set of secret military documents on the Vietnam War, to the New York Times. A year later, the White House Plumbers carried out the botched Watergate burglary. The Watergate scandal unfolds. The Watergate break-ins might have been forgotten after Nixon's re-election if not for the work of the Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. With the help of an anonymous source they called Deep Throat, Woodward and Bernstein discovered that Nixon's re-election campaign had paid the Plumbers to bug the Democrats' office. More details emerged when the Plumbers faced trial in 1973. During the legal proceedings, one plumber implicated Nixon's administration in a cover-up, claiming the defendants had been paid to lie in order to protect government officials. What the White House had originally attempted to dismiss as a third-rate burglary had become the Watergate scandal. As pressure to thoroughly investigate the scandal mounted, the Justice Department appointed Archibald Cox, a respected law professor, to serve as a special prosecutor. A special prosecutor is a non-government lawyer appointed by the Attorney General or Congress to investigate a federal official for misconduct while in office. After the Plumbers' trial, the Senate formed a committee to investigate the Watergate affair. In televised hearings, former White House counsel John Dean testified that Nixon had participated in efforts to cover up the White House's involvement in the Watergate break-in. Another former Nixon aide revealed that President Nixon had installed a recording system in the White House Oval Office to tape every conversation. The aide insisted that if the committee listened to the tapes, it would uncover whether the president had ordered a cover-up. In July 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee issued a subpoena or court order compelling Nixon to turn over several tapes. Nixon refused, invoking the right to withhold information known as executive privilege, a concept based in the constitutional separation of powers. Since the time of George Washington, presidents have argued that separation of powers granted the executive branch the right to operate without disclosing the details of every conversation, working document to the other government branches. Over the next few months, Nixon battled both the special prosecutor Cox and the Senate committee over the release of the White House tapes. On October 20th, 1973, in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon fired Cox. The president's own attorney general resigned in protest. For reasons unrelated to Watergate, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned that same month. He left office to avoid facing trial on charges of accepting bribes and evading taxes while governing Maryland. Nixon appointed Gerald Ford, Republican minority leader of the House of Representatives, to be Agnew's successor. In the July 1974 case, United States versus Nixon, the Supreme Court ruled that the president must release his tapes to the Senate. Once Nixon complied, the recordings proved beyond a doubt that he had ordered the Watergate cover-up. Nixon resigns in disgrace. Late in July, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon, accusing him of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Rather than face trial and almost certain conviction in the Senate, Nixon announced his resignation on August 8, 1974. The next day, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as president. "Our Constitution works," Ford said. "Our long national nightmare is over. To unify the country and put the Watergate mess to rest, Ford issued Nixon a presidential pardon in September. Rather than settle a controversy, the pardon ignited it. Some Americans wanted Nixon tried for his alleged crimes, while others preferred to move on from Watergate. Despite Ford's efforts to close this volatile chapter of presidential history, Americans remain deeply disillusioned with the nation's political leadership. Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968. While in office, he made strides toward easing the tensions of the Cold War. He also saw many of his domestic policies enacted. However, scandal forced him to resign in disgrace in 1974. New federalism. When he assumed office, President Nixon was determined to devolve the federal power. He intended to reduce the size and power of the federal government in order to return power to the states. Keys to his plan were revenue sharing, which allowed the state and local governments to spend tax revenue as they saw fit; Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA; Environmental Protection Agency; energy crisis, détente. Nixon encouraged détente policy of relaxing Cold War tensions. In 1972, he visited both Communist China and the Soviet Union. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. 1972, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev signed SALT I, the first superpower treaty designed to limit the arms race. Watergate scandal. 1972, burglars. Watergate scandal. New federalism. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, energy crisis, détente, SALT I, and Watergate scandal.